The United Nations climate report has dropped in what is another significant moment for the climate change movement. Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison responded to the report yesterday. So let's dive further into how the Australian government has responded with Ben Oquist, Executive Director of the Australia Institute. Great to see you, Ben. What did you make of the response that we saw from Scott Morrison yesterday?
Yeah, good morning, Adrian. Well, the government is in a difficult spot. The IPCC report is a clarion call for the world to take further dramatic action to avoid catastrophic climate change. And you've had a real muddle of a message from the government. A largely incoherent Deputy Prime Minister and Leader of the National Party this morning, where he said that the government couldn't come up with a plan, but couldn't act without a plan. You've really got a National Party going rogue on the Prime Minister, advocating for more coal-fired power stations, advocating for nuclear. While the rest of the world is demanding we get off fossil fuels, Australia is doubling down in them. And the Prime Minister didn't really have any plan yesterday. But what I think the IPCC report really does is spell a death knell for the idea of a gas-fired recovery. A clear message from the IPCC is we need to get off fossil fuels. Yet the Prime Minister has charted a course out of COVID that says we have to rely upon gas and a gas-fired recovery. The reality is that gas is a big fossil fuel emitter, a big emitter of methane, something that the IPCC in particular mentions we've got to get off faster because methane is such a potent greenhouse gas, particularly in the short term. So the gas-fired recovery is in trouble. Australian Institute research showed that the plans that are on foot for Australia's gas industry would amount to 13 times our annual emissions if we burnt all that gas, more emissions than any other country, the equivalent of any other country, China included. A lot of talk about China needing to take action. The problem for Australia is that we have all these plans for massive fossil fuel expansion, both in coal mines and in the gas industry, when the IPCC is saying we need to get off fossil fuels.
When we were listening to the Australian Prime Minister yesterday, I mean, he was being grilled in many ways, pushed really hard by the journalists at that press conference. This isn't political. I think many people know that the Prime Minister does have an answer for pretty much everything, but it can be a little bit difficult to find out exactly what he is saying at the moment. And the reason I bring that up is you hear John Kerry, who is a powerful voice, and he's very clear with what needs to happen. President Joe Biden, very clear. What is the real challenge for the Prime Minister right now in terms of the difficulty he has to perhaps commit to making some changes that we might need to see here?
Well, the problem for him is that the world has moved beyond net zero by 2050 and the Prime Minister won't even commit to that. The real task at hand is what Australia needs to do by 2030. And you mentioned Biden, the UK government, the European Union are all moving for much more ambitious 2030 targets. And meanwhile, Australia is doing very little. And the Prime Minister likes to talk about his record. But the reality is Australia has the second most emissions-intensive energy sector in the world, behind Poland. We've got the third most emissions-intensive transport sector, yet the government seems unwilling or unable to act to do anything about it. And as the world moves, there are massive geostrategic, financial, trade, security, foreign policy, diplomatic consequences from Australia. So he finds himself in a very tight bind, unwilling to act or unable to act because of the National Party and Barnaby Joyce effectively going rogue and preventing any action. But really, they're just talking about whether they can commit to net zero by 2050. But that's clearly not enough. And the rest of the world's gone well past that debate. And I think that's the real problem as we head into Glasgow. There's going to be more talk of further action from our trading partners, foreign policy partners about taking more ambitious action on climate change. And meanwhile, we're stuck debating yesterday's debate about net zero by 2050 when the world's moving on to how do we get off fossil fuels, how do we stop financing coal in other countries? How do we have a more ambitious 2030 target? How do we stop exporting so much gas or coal? And the Prime Minister stuck still debating Barnaby Joyce about yesterday's debate.
So where to from here, just to wrap, in terms of the government's position, the next milestones in a way, and how do you think they are really going to try and tackle this issue over the next 6 months?
Well, the big pressure is going to come in the lead up to Glasgow, and it's simply impossible for the Prime Minister and the Australian government to go to Glasgow and not having committed to net zero by 2050. So a lot more diplomatic pressure in the lead up to that conference, the G20, before that in Italy. And I think the reality is that unless there's an upswelling of community opposition to the lack of an action, we're not going to see it. But the trade implications are very big for Australia. The European Union's talking about a carbon border adjustment tax, and it's being debated now in the United States. So the danger for Australia is, even if it doesn't want to act on climate change for climate reasons, that there are so many financial, strategic, foreign policy and trade implications of not acting, that big crunch is going to come on the government in the lead up to Glasgow. So in a way, the IPCC report this week is just the start of a big 12 weeks of debate in the lead up to Glasgow. The bottom 20% get nothing. They're really unfair tax cuts.
People want to see much stronger action from the government when it comes to climate change.
It's no coincidence that we have a wages crisis in Australia.
Transitioning to net zero emissions, it doesn't seem like there's much room for gas.